All right, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
So today we will be looking at the second part of Exodus 13. So starting at verse 17 through the end of chapter 13, and then all of chapter 14. Sorry I didn't get a post up on Facebook today, hopefully, or earlier this week, but it's a well-known story that we kind of what we think of as the culmination of the Exodus story, or the story that we read in children's books, and probably the most popular part of the Exodus story, really. And I really appreciated the worship that Carrie and Josh led, and your selection of songs that talk about and reference the salvation and deliverance out of slavery that Yahweh provided Israel, and also is providing to us today. So thank you for that. So this is also a very interesting portion of the story because it's kind of a transition moment. Israel is leaving Egypt and becoming their people, like the song that we sang this morning. They're now are a nation of their own. They're no longer slaves. So it's a new beginning for Israel. It's fulfilling the promises that God had made to Abraham and Jacob and Joseph in the past, and that we were read in Genesis, but didn't really seem to be happening. And now all of a sudden we're seeing those come to fruition. We're seeing Yahweh come down to be with his people. We're seeing a desire, God wanting to commune with his people. And we've seen it through Genesis and throughout the story, but this is here as we see it's as literal as it has been. And we'll talk about it, but it shows how God desired to commune with his people. And we're going to talk a little bit about testing and how now God and Israel are getting to know each other, kind of, and God's working with his people. So these are all things, and then salvation, of course, as well. So these are all things that will be continued through the rest of Exodus and are kind of being introduced here. So I'll just introduce them, and they'll be looked at in more detail later. And yet we're also still looking at some of the same themes that we've talked about extensively over the past couple months, and God strikes against Egypt. So again, we're going to see Pharaoh's resolve is going to be hardened, and Yahweh is making his name known through this, same way as he was through the plagues. We're going to also see the theme of decreation, then, like Dorb talked about with the plagues. So you can think of this story as a transition story. You can think of it as the 11th plague, really, since all the themes are repeated, and it's the deliverance of Israel. So there's a lot of interesting things happening here. So this is kind of what we're going to talk about. So as you can see, we're kind of going to jump around a lot. So we're just kind of going to go through the verses, look at the themes that are occurring in the verses, and kind of review some and introduce some. All right. So I'm going to start reading in Exodus chapter 13, verse 17. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, "Lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt." But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness towards the Red Sea. And the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt, equipped for battle. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here." And they moved on from Succoth and encamped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord and Yahweh went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night, the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. But he did not depart from his people. So here we see some of those things I mentioned. So first off, we see that God is guiding the people of Israel. He's telling them where to go. They're not just running away towards the route that they seem best, but God is directing their path. And even though the way of the Philistines, which would be right here up along the lake or the Mediterranean Sea, not like that would have been the easiest and the most direct way to get up here to Israel or Canaan. But God told them not to go that way because he didn't want Israel to be tested. He knew that there's probably a lot of military forts and things along here. The Philistines lived around here. So it would have been challenging for his people. And so he told them to go around this way to avoid that conflict. So we see God's direction in their journey. And then we also saw that Moses had took the bones of Joseph, which is really amazing, I think, because it shows us a couple things. It shows that Joseph believed the promise that Yahweh had made to his father Jacob and to Isaac and to Abraham. He had believed it and he had instructed the people. And remember, this is like 400 years after Joseph first came to Egypt. And so the people, it shows that the people also remembered Joseph, even though it seems like they don't really remember a whole lot about Yahweh, and they still have a lot of work to do, but still for 400 years, somebody took care of Joseph's bones and remembered that request and kept looking for this day. And now this day is finally here. And then, so talking about the map, the road, I think it's really interesting and helpful for us to like picture in our heads what's going on. And a quick, just for knowledge sake, I guess, this is the reason I said here, Sea of Reeds and not Red Sea. The Hebrew is all Sea of Reeds. It never says Red Sea in Hebrew. But some of the earliest English, I think Latin translations, you just saw that and looked at the map and, oh, the Red Sea's over here. Let's just put Red Sea in instead of Sea of Reeds. So if anybody, I think it's a good thing to know. If somebody challenges it or whatever. But so here, modern day is the Suez Canal. Before the Suez Canal was built, there would have been a lot of lakes and marshes and bodies of water there. So we don't really know where they actually went, but probably like somewhere in here, not here, is what most people think. And yet, regardless of that fact, I don't think it really changes the fact of the points of the story, and it was still they were still delivered. But just wanted to point it out so you're aware of it. And then that was really zoomed in. So here's a zoomed out version so you can better picture it. So the Sinai Peninsula right here is this. So this is the area that they're going to spend the rest of Exodus in, this little spot. All right. So then next up, we see that Yahweh went before them. In the day, he was a pillar of cloud. That's the best picture I could find that is what I would maybe picture it as. I don't think these were like little wispy clouds, like a little plane. God is Yahweh's presence, it must have been something powerful and like awe-inspiring, like something that would induce fear and reverence, I think. And so Yahweh is right there. They can look and they can see Yahweh is here with us. And then by night, a pillar of fire. And it says that it did not depart from before the people. And this is something that we're going to talk a lot more about in Exodus. God wants to be close to his people, but sometimes his people don't really want to be close to him. And it's things like this, they're kind of scary. Like God is is a powerful being, and he's not like C.S. Lewis says in Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan isn't a tame lion. Like, and I think that it's the same. I mean, that's a good picture of God, and God wants to be with his people, and yet and he's there for them, and sometimes his people don't want to be with him. We'll talk about that more later. All right. That now we'll continue on in Exodus chapter 14. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-zephon. You shall encamp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say to the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land. The wilderness has shut them in, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, or strengthen his resolve, and will pursue them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, and the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh." And they did so. So now we have a little cut scene back to Egypt. Verse 5. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants were changed towards the people. And they said, "What is this that we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him. He took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt, and the officers, all of them, and with officers over all of them. And Yahweh hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel, while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. And the Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them and camped by the sea by Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal-zephon. So here we see that God warned Moses that Pharaoh was coming. So Moses, I guess, could prepare and knew that God was still in control, and wouldn't freak out when he saw the Egyptians coming. Then we go back to Egypt, and I think Dorv talked a little bit about when he talked about the 10th plague, like what kind of tone did Pharaoh use when he let them go, and like when he asked for a blessing. And I think this shows that with all the other times that Pharaoh said, get out of here, and then changed his mind, he's doing it again one final time, and that he never, after a day or two of getting over it, he realized that no, he's not gonna lose to Israel. He's not gonna lose to this Yahweh. I'm gonna go get them. And God gave them the courage to go pursue Israel. And so now we have the Egyptians coming, and we have a sea in front of us. And so continue reading in verse 10. And when Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to Yahweh. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we have said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than die in the wilderness." And Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of Yahweh, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians who you see today, you will never see again. Yahweh will fight for you, and you only have to be silent." All right, so we see here that Pharaoh seemed to kind of forget the 10 plagues when he's coming after him. He seemed to think he still had a chance at beating Yahweh. And it seems like the people of Israel have kind of forgotten about it too, even though it's a couple days ago. As soon as they're out of that situation, they start to forget Yahweh's power, and now they're scared. They're fear the Egyptians. And I don't think we can really blame them or be too hard on them. I mean, they have been enslaved to these people for years. I'm sure they've suffered lots of abuse under them. And it takes time to recover from that. And so I think that it's not unreasonable for Israel to be scared like they are, and try to see it from the way that it would be for them. And so they're facing death from the Egyptians and death in the waters. And as we've talked about a little bit, I think Genesis and through Genesis and Exodus a little bit, water is often a theme of death. And like before creation, everything was covered in waters. The flood, waters, was associated with that. So water is chaos, it's death. So they're between two deaths essentially, and they have to choose which death they prefer. Is and so they're calling out to Moses and accusing him and saying, why did you do this? And then Moses' response to the people: fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of Yahweh, which he will work for you today. Yahweh will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. That's just amazing. We're going to see here what the salvation of Yahweh looks like. And even though the people of Israel are terrified and don't seem to be trusting God, even though Yahweh is right there, like the pillars of fire and cloud are right there still, Yahweh is working with them. He's going to deliver them. So when I talk about salvation of Yahweh, this is the first time in the Bible actually that salvation is used. The word occurred once in Genesis, but not in the context like this. This is the first time the word salvation is used in the context of Yahweh providing salvation to humans. So salvation, I don't know how I didn't know this before, but the Hebrew word for salvation is Yeshua, which I mean is Jesus, and which Jesus is our English word for Jesus, but accurately it would probably be Joshua. Like Jesus should probably be called Joshua today, but so Jesus is salvation, and I just thought it was really cool. And this I think is a great example of what Yahweh's salvation looks like. Yahweh's salvation to Israel here, and then Yahweh's salvation to us through Jesus. There's a lot of similarities here, and we can see what it shows us who God is as and what he wants to do. So the salvation of Yahweh, I'm gonna look at this a little bit. So the salvation is talked about in the Psalms more than anywhere else in the Old Testament. It's talked about in the Psalms, and the Psalms often refer to salvation as God, which I thought was really interesting, especially if you think about it as Jesus, translating to Jesus. So there's many examples. I just picked out a couple. So Psalms 42, chapter 42, verse 11. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. And then similarly in Psalm 62, verse 2, he alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. And so I think salvation is often something I think of as like an action almost, like provide salvation, or it's like an abstract thing. But I thought it was really interesting, and something I hadn't noticed before, that in the Psalms is often salvation is Yahweh, God, and salvation is a person, and which just makes this even more relevant. And then I thought this was really interesting as well. In Luke chapter 19, verse 9, Jesus is visiting Zacchaeus. And when Jesus goes into Zacchaeus, he says, "Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." And so here, I'm not sure how much to read into it, because they wouldn't have been speaking Hebrew, and the Aramaic, right? So I'm not sure how similar Aramaic is to Hebrew. But I think it's really, so Jesus could be saying, today Jesus has come to this house and is claiming deity here. And I think there is validity that he is claiming deityship here, because he also is saying then the Son of Man, which we know is claiming of Godhood too. So I thought that was really unique. So let's look at salvation that Yahweh provided to Egypt or to Israel here, and how that might compare to the salvation he provides to us today. First of all, it didn't require anything of Israel. They didn't have to draw their swords and fight. They just had to stand firm and be silent, and Yahweh was going to do everything for them. And then salvation was provided. They were essentially, Israel was dead. There was death on both sides. Essentially, they were in a state of death. And so we'll see how salvation played out then as we continue the story. So kind of keep that in mind. All right, going back to Exodus 14. Okay, starting in verse 15. Yahweh said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they go in after them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, his chariots and his horsemen, and the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." Then the angel of God went before the host of Israel and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was a cloud in the darkness, and it lit up the night, without one coming near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord Yahweh drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all of Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. In the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and of cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from before Israel, where Yahweh fights for them against the Egyptians." All right, so we see here that Yahweh is providing his salvation. He's opened up the waters for Israel to pass through. And here you may recognize there's very strong themes going back to creation, how a wind or a ruach, God's ruach or spirit is dividing the waters, which is exactly what happened on day one of creation. So we're seeing creation, God's power here. So here's the second thing that the people of Israel have to do, or the only thing they really have to do, is they have to trust God and walk through here. I don't know if you would walk through there. There's and imagine it's a wind. There's a wind blowing strong enough to do this. So I'm imagining hurricane level winds, and you have to walk through there, knowing that essentially it's death. And so you have to choose. Yet Yahweh told you that He will deliver you. So you can stand here and trust in your own strength to fight the Egyptians, or go back and be a slave to Egypt. Go back to the old way of life in Egypt, or you can trust God and go through the waters of death and trust in Him to deliver that salvation. And then we see that Egypt tried to follow Israel. They chased them into here, and Yahweh intervenes and causes their chariot wheels to get stuck and fall off, or not super clear what's happening, but somehow slowing Egypt down. In Egypt, I think this is really funny because it's like, let us flee from before Israel, for Yahweh fights for them against the Egyptians. Like, it took them this long to figure out that Yahweh's fighting against them. Like, it's been going on for a while. It seems like they realized in the end that Yahweh he's gonna deliver the people of Israel, and there's nothing Egypt can do to stop it. And yet we'll see that it's too late for them. All right, so continue reading in verse 26. Yahweh said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians and their chariots and upon their horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, Yahweh threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea, and the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen. Of all the hosts of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord Yahweh saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. And Israel saw the great power that Yahweh used against the Egyptians. And so the people feared Yahweh, and they believed in Yahweh and his servant Moses. So here we see kind of the climax of this plague narrative. God's judgment against Egypt and his final deliverance of the people of Israel out of slavery. No longer are they going to be pursued or enslaved by Egypt. I think as this is something then, like the violence of Yahweh, that is hard for us to understand, and they're going to we will have a whole sermon on the violence of Yahweh and what it means and how that fits in with his character as well. But for today, I want to focus on the salvation that was provided to the people of Israel. And again, the final theme I will say about the destruction of Egypt is that it again reminds us a lot of the flood, where sin is destroyed through water. And they're very similar to decreation, like Dorb talked about through the other plagues. Here we see decreation through, like, creation is separating the waters, decreation is bringing the waters back. All right. So kind of to review a little bit of the wrap up the narrative. Yahweh has been working through these plagues and finally through this to make his name known to Egypt and to carry out his deliverance of Israel. And as some of the readings today, or through worship, we know that Yahweh's name was made known. The people knew who Yahweh was after this. And as Israel journeys and interacts with other people groups, they often will know Yahweh and what he did to Egypt. Yahweh's salvation is Jesus. Jesus is salvation for us today. And we see what salvation, that salvation is offered to us, and it may require us to walk through death, but to trust in God, and God will do the salvation part himself. And I think this is really, again, I don't know how, I haven't done the theological studying or whatever, but it reminds me a lot of baptism, what we use today. It's going through waters. We're symbolizing death in that, and then coming out as alive and a new creation. And I think this really was the baptism of Israel, that they went through, they trusted in God, and now they are truly his people. They're no longer slaves. And yet we'll see in the future that that doesn't mean they're going to do everything right. So, but this is kind of the start of their journey. And then finally, we just want to introduce it a little bit so you start thinking about it. Israel kind of has passed their first test, and we're going to talk about testing, and it'll be more explicit in some of the future chapters. But here, their test, I want you guys to think about testing as an opportunity provided to Israel for them to get to know God better, to grow closer to Yahweh. And so here, they were put in a situation that seemed impossible. It was a test, and yet they trusted in God and were delivered through it. And now, as a result, they're closer to Yahweh. They feared Yahweh, they believed in Yahweh. And we'll see more examples of that, how well or poorly Israel does it, passing the tests and drawing closer to God.